And so we set up this thing. We said, okay, one of the two was going to be selected to design a pot, mentally or however they wanted to do it, and sit down in front of the group and make a dozen of them, a series, exactly alike. And they were going to explain it to the other potter, and that person would have to sit down and make a dozen of the same pot. And so it turned out Hamada was selected to make the pot, the design it. And he thought for a while, and then he sat down. And I can't remember now, you know, I sat through this whole thing, but I can't remember for the life of me, because ordinarily he threw off a hump. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember whether he threw off a hump or whether he weighed out clay. I think he threw off a hump. Anyway, he was working on a strange wheel. We had our Leach wheels that we'd brought home from England, and I was trailing for Hamada while he was throwing and all. And so he threw the first bowl. It was a little soup bowl he designed, just mentally in his head. And he threw it, and he kind of studied it for a while, and then he cut it off and put it on the board in front of it. And then he threw a second one. And he cut it off and put it on the board in front of him. And then he looked at it for a long time, and he began to laugh. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Second pot, always the worst pot." He said, "If you make a series of pots, the first one you make, you're designing it, you're creating it. And so it has that quality of creation. But when you make the second one, you're tracing the first one. And you don't really understand it." And he said, if you made 100, you should perhaps exceed the quality of the first one. But it'll take that long to really know the pot. Anyway, the upshot was that was an interesting, he made a dozen pots. And then Leach, having watched him and listened to him, sat down and he made a dozen pots. They were nothing like Hamada's at all. It was just incredible. Leach, because of his own personality and a sense of proportion that he had in himself, I could draw a picture with a pencil. They were so different. Had a little rim here and came down with a break. So, and a low foot on it like that, turned on it the following day. And it was, it was a soup bowl, if you want to say. Bird's pot, now I'm going to have to draw more carefully because his pot was like this, and there was a break, but then it came down. It was a very deep bowl because that was what Bernard felt was right. And, and it had a much deeper foot on it than Hamada's too. They were really two radically different bowls. But Bernard just couldn't bring himself to make that pot. It wasn't in him to do it. And that was an interesting thing for us to
especially since you'd had to make the same pot
over
and over and over.
Well, when we left the Leach pottery, we'd lived with Leach in the time we were there, because he had just separated from his second wife and couldn't stand to live alone. Asked us if we wanted to share his house, and we did. And at first we were really very reticent to express ourselves, but after 2 years we began to know one another quite well, and we could express ourselves easily with him. And we would say, Bernard, what we're doing here it's not what you wrote about in your book, which was what we influenced our asking him to work with him. And we argue back and forth on that, and it's true, but part of the problem was that Bernard had turned the pottery over to his son, David, to run, to manage. He was the manager of the workshop. And David was no artist. He was a good potter, but he was no artist at all. And his attitude was, and I resented it at the time, but now looking back, I can understand. David was running a pottery which had a dozen people dependent on that pottery for paychecks. And he had to have a certain amount of pots made. They had to be saleable to stores and to people, and to know what the Leach pottery was expecting and all. And so he was really pushing like mad for production and exactness and all. And Bernard, one day he came in the house and he said, "I've just seen so many good pots destroyed today. Pots that David said were not up to the form." But Bernard saw them as good pots. And he probably would have run the pottery differently. But because he'd given it to David, he never took it back. And he said, David's got to make his own mistakes. You know who was influenced by that term? Peter Rolkes. And not in the way that Hamada imagined. He didn't. Volkes was really intrigued by meeting Hamada there. And in fact, he was the person who kicked the wheel for him out at Archie Bray.
Oh, wow.
Because they never had a Japanese-style wheel for Hamada to work on. And Pete was impressed, and he asked Hamada if he would look at his work and comment on it. And the only comment that Hamada would make was, "Why don't you let the clay participate more in your pottery?" Pete was making big narrow neck models, exquisite things. You know, he was a hell of a thrower, good thrower and all. But it was they were very severe, and they didn't have much feeling in them. And when he painted on them, they were more excited. And anyway, when Hamada said this to him, that was what started him to play around with the clay and begin to punch holes and cut it and reshape it and so on, and eventually give up the pot form completely. Which Hamada did not expect.